Alright everyone, today we're going to be looking at a brand new iceberg that I just finished creating, the Mass Disappearances Iceberg. As the name suggests, mass disappearances are cases where multiple people, from 2 to hundreds, all vanish all at once without a trace. In many cases, these people were never seen again. In others, they have been found in mysterious and/or disturbing circumstances. If you aren't aware of how iceberg videos work, they start off at the top where we cover more well-known entries, and as we go down and as the videos continue, we start to get down into more obscure and usually more unsettling entries. Since this is the first video in this series, we're going to be starting off at the top, and if you guys are interested and you want to see more, I'll continue this on with more parts and we'll continue to dive deeper and deeper down the iceberg. With all that being said, grab a snack, get comfortable, and shut the blinds. The McStay Family. Joseph McStay was an entrepreneur who ran Earth-Inspired Products, a company which built decorative water fountains. He and his wife, Summer, lived with their 2 children, Joseph Jr., age 3, and Gianni, age 4, in Fallbrook, California, around 40 miles north of San Diego. They purchased their home on November 17, 2009, for the price of $330,000. With their budding family, new home, and seemingly successful business venture, it was apparently an exciting time for the McStay family. Just over 2 months after purchasing the home, on the 4th of February 2010, Joseph McStay had a phone call with his father. The two chatted for a bit before Joseph told his father that he had a meeting to catch for the day. That was the last time anyone would have any significant contact with Joseph, his wife Summer, or either of the 2 children. That night, however, at 8:28 p.m., Joseph's cell phone placed a call to his business associate, Charles Chase Merritt, which went unanswered. Chase was a good friend of Joseph's and worked closely with him at Earth-Inspired Products, specifically tending to the welding and metalwork of the fountains. Chase later claimed to the police that he let his phone go to voicemail because he was watching a movie. Starting on the 4th of February, neighbors, family, and friends began noticing that neither Joseph nor Summer were responding to any text messages or phone calls, which was odd for the family. This would increasingly raise suspicion among those close with the family as they unsuccessfully attempted to make contact with them over several days. On February 13th, Joseph's brother Michael had had enough and, concerned for his brother's well-being, visited the McStay family home in search of answers. Upon his arrival, presumably after knocking on the front door and finding no response, Mike hopped the fence into the backyard, finding the 2 family dogs, Bear and Dickie, running around. Surprisingly, he found that the dogs' water bowls were full, even after all these days had passed. He suspected that the family may have gone on a spontaneous trip and had hired someone to take care of the dogs. To test this theory, he moved the dog bowls to a different location to see if they would be placed back in their original location. Mike was also able to gain entry into the home through an open window in the back of the house. Upon entering, he found the home to be completely deserted. It doesn't seem that he stayed to look around much for any clues, but the empty home left him unsettled about the situation. Afterwards, he departed from the home and returned the following day to find that someone indeed had been taking care of the dogs, discovering that the dog bowls had been placed back where they originally had been the day prior. This time, he left a note for whoever was taking care of the family's pets, explaining who he was and requesting more information about the whereabouts of his brother. He ended the letter by jotting down his phone number. One day later, Michael's phone began to ring, but he was caught off guard by the name that popped up. It was Animal Control. They informed Michael that they had only been visiting the property each day as a response to numerous reports that they had received of the animals being left outside, since it appeared they had been completely forgotten by the homeowners. This, obviously, was not the news that Michael had been hoping for. It only served as evidence of his suspicion that something terrible had happened to his brother's family. Not long after this development, on the 15th of February, Michael called the San Diego County Sheriff's Department and officially reported the family as missing. On the 19th of February, a search warrant was executed on the home by homicide investigators. They declared that no signs of foul play or a struggle were found, but it did seem that the family had left in an extremely hasty fashion, with a carton of eggs being found on the counter and 2 child-sized bowls of popcorn sitting on the couch. Only adding to the confusion were the suitcases found upstairs in the home, partially packed with clothes and toiletries. Investigators would eventually search through the family's computer, discovering searches for, quote, "What documents do children need for traveling to Mexico?" along with inquiries for Spanish language lessons. Eventually, it was also discovered that the family's vehicle, a white 1996 Isuzu Trooper, had been found around 55 miles south, just north of the Mexican border. It was initially impounded as an abandoned vehicle until the connection was made to the McStay case. A neighbor who was interviewed about the missing family discovered that their home security camera had picked up what appeared to be the bottom half of the family's vehicle passing by their home on the evening of February 4th. However, due to the angle, it was impossible to see through the windows at any occupants inside. Because of the car's proximity to the Mexican border when it was found, authorities began to review security footage from the Mexican-American pedestrian gate. This led them to discover this video captured the night of February 8th, where a family of 4, which closely resembled the McStays, crosses the border on foot. However, despite this, the rest of the McStays' extended family, when shown the video, were not convinced that the individuals pictured were their loved ones. They couldn't come to grips with how the family could leave their pets unattended outside and not tell a single person about where they were going or what was going on before taking the hour drive to the border and disappearing. It just didn't make any sense to them. Furthermore, many of them felt that the 4 people caught by the surveillance cameras had different height, weight, and overall builds from their family members. Joseph's mother even went on record stating that the man who was supposedly her son had a walk that was definitely not his. Despite these statements by the rest of the family, Interpol was notified that the McStays may have traveled into Mexico and that they should keep their eyes peeled. Due to the indications that the family had left the country of their own volition, the investigators neglected to treat the home as the potential scene of a crime, contaminating any possible DNA evidence inside the home. Weeks would pass without any significant developments until April, when the FBI joined the investigation, focusing mainly on Mexico as that's where it was largely suspected the family had ran off to at the time. This theory was eventually reinforced when the authorities started looking into the emails of the McStays and found that they had been looking into how to obtain passports for a trip to Mexico. After weeks, it would be months and eventually years without any further indication of the McStays' whereabouts. November 11th, 2013. 3 years and 9 months since the family's initial disappearance. a motorcyclist is riding through the desert near Victorville, California, 85 miles north of the McStay home, when he comes across 2 shallow graves in the sand, along with the remains of 4 people, a man, a woman, and 2 children. Even more disturbing, a white extension cord was found wrapped around the neck of the man, along with a 3-pound hammer laying buried beside the bodies. After the examination of dental records and other forensic evidence, the bodies were confirmed undeniably to be those of the McStay family. Authorities believe that the family died of blunt force trauma inside of their home and were buried in the desert afterwards. This news, obviously, was violently disturbing to the rest of the family, who up until this point must have been desperately clinging to even the smallest possibility that their family members were still alive somewhere. To learn that their budding, innocent family died in such a terrible way could only have been unimaginably shocking. The investigation took a hard turn from here, shifting from trying to locate the whereabouts of the family to tracking down a killer. It didn't take long for suspicion to start rising around Joseph's business partner, Charles Chase Merritt, who apparently had felony convictions for both burglary and receiving stolen property. Most recent of these was in 2001 when he stole $32,000 of welding and drilling equipment from San Gabriel Valley Ornamental Iron Works in Monrovia, California. In an interview, an acquaintance who knew Merritt in the 1980s told CBS News 8 in San Diego that he has a checkered past, stating that they think police should look at him and anyone associated with him. Only years later, in 2013, was it discovered that Charles had apparently spent over an hour with Joseph the day that they went missing, even going as far as to state in an interview that he was, quote, definitely the last person he saw. Things reached a tipping point when investigators checked the McStay family's Isuzu Trooper and found Merritt's DNA inside of the vehicle. Charles Merritt was arrested on November 5th, 2014, and was eventually found guilty of the murders. The prosecutors believe that Charles murdered the family in search of financial gain to fuel his gambling addiction. During the trial, it was said that Charles forged several checks from Joseph's business account after the family was murdered, totaling to $21,000. Apparently, he then went on a gambling spree at several local casinos and lost thousands. In interviews with the police just days after the disappearances, Charles was already referring to Joseph and his family in the past tense, saying things like, "He was my best friend." This was called out by the interviewer because, as far as he knew, they were still alive, right? When all was said and done, Charles Merritt was sentenced to death on January 21st, 2020, and currently sits on death row. The Springfield Three. It is late into the afternoon on June 6th, 1992, in Springfield, Missouri. 2 friends, Suzanne Streeter and Stacy McCall, had graduated from Kickapoo High School only hours earlier, and had been celebrating by attending multiple graduation parties in the area with their friends. The plan at the time was to crash with some of the other graduates at their friend Janelle Kirby's house. However, upon feeling that the house was too crowded, Susie asked Stacy if she just wanted to come over and stay at her house, where she had just bought a brand new king-sized waterbed. The group had made plans to go visit a nearby water park the next day, so the 2 girls agreed to meet back up in the morning to tag along. Stacy agreed to go with Susie, and at around 2 o'clock in the morning, they shoved off from Janelle's house, each driving their respective cars to the home, located at 1717 East Delmar Street, where Susie lived with her single mother, Cheryl Levitt. The following morning, Susie's best friend Nigel Holderby gave her a call at the house to see when the two were planning on heading out for the water park, but the call would go to voicemail. Nigel ended up leaving her a message and waited for her to call back, but she never would call back. Stacy's mom Janice would try calling the house as well in an attempt to reach her daughter, but would also have her call go unanswered. She would also leave a message, as well as two more as the hours ticked by, still hearing nothing back. Unsure of what the move was for the water park, the friends from last night made their way over to Susie's house to figure out what was going on. Stacy's mom Janice would also drive over out of concern for her daughter. They would find all three cars parked out in the driveway: Stacy's, Susie's, and her mother Cheryl's Mitsubishi Eclipse. This, apparently, was already strange for Nigel, who knew how particular Cheryl would be about parking her car in the carport. Apparently, she was, quote, almost OCD to some degree. There were some things that I teased her about. Where she parked her car was always the same. Upon reaching the doorstep, Janelle found the porch light shattered, with glass strewn about on the ground. Even more peculiar, she found the front door to be unlocked, with no sign of Stacy, Susie, or her mother Cheryl inside, or anywhere else on the property. They would find the TV on, displaying only static, as well as Cinnamon, the family's Yorkshire Terrier, who seemed to be very anxious. Janice would be the first to point out that all three of the woman's purses were sitting together on the floor in the living room, containing all three of their wallets and keys. Sitting nearby were Stacy's clothes folded neatly from the previous night. Another important fact was that Cheryl and Susie had both left their cigarettes behind. This was particularly alarming, since Cheryl had been described as a chain smoker and wouldn't have willingly gone far without them. It was right around here that several different mistakes were made, although it's tough to blame any of the people involved in these mistakes for making them because they obviously had no idea of the severity of the situation. Janelle's boyfriend, just trying to help, swept up the glass from the porch light and threw it away, which investigators would later condemn as destroying potential evidence. Even worse, everyone else, probably just trying to calm their nerves and do whatever they could, started cleaning up the house, walking all around and moving things back to their original location if they seemed out of place. Apparently, when all was said and done, 20 or so different people had entered the house that day, failing to realize that they were disturbing a possible crime scene. If that wasn't bad enough, the house apparently would receive several phone calls that morning, according to Janice, that were strangely sexual. However, instead of trying to pursue the caller, they simply hung up on them. The strange caller would even leave a message on the house's answering machine before somebody in the house accidentally erased it. I know it was obviously a lapse of judgment in the moment, but it's just so painful to think about the idea that there may have been a very important clue in that message or some sort of DNA evidence around the house that was ultimately destroyed. The three would be reported as missing several hours later, and an investigation would slowly begin to snowball in the home. Strangely, the police were able to determine that Cheryl's bed had been slept in during the previous night, finding a turned-over book and a pair of eyeglasses beside the bed, possibly indicating that she had been pulled away from her book by something or someone. Aside from the shattered porch light, there seemed to be no sign of a struggle, though the blinds in Suzanne's room were pulled apart, seeming as though someone had been peering outside at something. Another frustrating slip-up occurred on December 31st, 1992, when a man phoned the America's Most Wanted hotline, claiming to have information regarding the disappearances. But when the switchboard operator tried to connect the call to Springfield investigators, the call was accidentally dropped. The police still wish to contact this man, whom they apparently have reason to believe possessed, quote, prime knowledge of the occurrences that night. There have been several eyewitness testimonies of people claiming to have seen the girls, all of which remain inconclusive and none of which have been confirmed. One witness claimed to have seen a woman matching Suzanne's appearance in the driver's seat of an old moss green Dodge van later in the day on June 7th. She reported that the woman appeared terrified and was told to not do anything stupid by a man hidden in the vehicle. This occurrence was only reported several days after it was witnessed. Other witnesses would report seeing the same van in the area after the disappearances. Of note, however, was one man in particular who claimed to have seen a blonde woman sitting in the driver's seat of one of these vans parked in front of a grocery store. Apparently, the van was suspicious enough to actually jot down the license plate on a newspaper, but not suspicious enough to hang on to that newspaper because he threw it away before calling the police. The amount of mistakes made during this case is horrifying, to say the least. They tried to hypnotize the man to see if he could recall the license plate, but obviously that did not work. Other leads follow this man who was apparently seen in the area around the time of the disappearances, as well as statements by a man named Robert Cox, who was a convicted kidnapper and robber. He claimed that he had knowledge that these women would never be found again, and that they were apparently buried somewhere near Cheryl's home. Interestingly, Robert Cox actually worked with Stacy's dad at a car dealership, but his story kept changing so much that it's very difficult to take any of it with confidence. His facts kept changing, and the police eventually concluded that he was just trying to get attention. Almost 32 years later, the case of the Springfield Three is still unsolved, and it's unclear if we'll ever know exactly what happened to these poor girls. The Roanoke Colony. This is definitely one of the more popular cases on this iceberg. I'm sure many of you have heard of the Roanoke Colony, but it's also one of the most baffling, as over 100 people all went missing all at once. On the 8th of May, 1587, approximately 120 English colonists sailed across the Atlantic under the leadership of John White, in an attempt to restart a settlement that the English had abandoned the previous year on Roanoke Island, off the coast of present-day North Carolina in the Outer Banks. After several attacks from the natives shortly after their arrival, the colonists would request that John White return to England to explain their perilous situation and to request more materials, tools, weapons, and other colonists to strengthen their position on the island, and with some hesitation, he would depart back for Europe. However, his return mission would be heavily delayed due to battles between the English and the Spanish Armada, preventing a relief mission from reaching Roanoke Island in a timely manner. He would only make his way back to Roanoke Island in August of 1590, 3 years after his departure, only to find each and every one of the men, women, and children completely missing. The only clue left behind was the word Croatoan, which was carved into a fence post, as well as the word crow, which was carved into a nearby tree. No signs of a struggle or an attack were found on the island, and no remains of any of the 120 colonists were ever discovered. Now, in order to understand what might have actually happened here, we're going to have to go back in time a few years before this set of colonists arrived to the original set of colonists which this group intended to replace. 6 years prior, in 1584, 2 ships made their way to the New World, with the goal of finding a location to set up the very first permanent English colony in America, eventually landing in the Outer Banks. They quickly would come into contact with local natives who lived in the area, developing surprisingly good relations with them. The natives would invite the colonists to their settlement in Roanoke Island, where they remained for a month before heading back to England, reporting an amazing new land in the New World, which they called Virginia. As a result of their favorable findings, in 1585, 7 more ships would leave from England carrying around 600 men, loaded with enough supplies to sustain them for around a year, led by Sir Ralph Lane, the newly appointed governor of this new colony. However, upon reaching the Outer Banks, the flagship, which carried the bulk of the food and supplies, had crashed into a shoal, filling it with water and ruining most of its contents. This forced Lane and the rest of the colonists to lean heavily on the natives and request way more food than they were capable of providing. Before long, they began to feel that their generosity was being taken advantage of, and the friendly relationship between the two began to sour. Only complicating matters further, the diseases that were carried by the colonists quickly began spreading to the natives. Obviously, at the time, neither of them knew exactly what was going on, but the natives felt that the colonists had been intentionally trying to harm them. These factors caused the two groups to eventually sever their relations with one another, leading to the natives living on Roanoke Island to completely abandon the area in favor of moving to a larger village on the mainland. Unfortunately, the colonists started to become suspicious of the natives, believing that they had gone to the mainland village in order to increase their numbers before attacking the colonists. This led to Lane and the rest of the colonists preemptively ambushing the mainland village, killing everybody, including Wingina, the very first Native American leader to be encountered by the colonists. Time passed until the year 1586, when another English explorer, Sir Francis Drake, about to return to Europe, brought his fleet around to Roanoke Colony. He found the colonists depleted of their resources and restocked them with 4 months of supplies, as well as a ship called the Francis, which they immediately lost control of during a hurricane, and it was swept out to sea. After that, Lane and the other colonists living at the Roanoke Colony were just absolutely done dealing with all these problems and decided to abandon the colony altogether and head back to England with Drake and his fleet. 2 weeks later, another fleet on its way to England made a pit stop at Roanoke Island, but obviously found it deserted. As a result, they dropped 15 men off to maintain English presence in the area before resuming course for Europe. It was at this point that John White would be appointed to lead the second expedition to Roanoke Island in 1587, and it would again be this group which would become known as the Lost Colony. Now, this is where the oddities really began, as John White knew about those 15 colonists who were supposedly on Roanoke Island, but when he got there, he was surprised to find it completely abandoned. The houses were left completely empty, and there was essentially no sign that these 15 men had ever even been on the island, aside from a single pile of human bones. Making the situation even more precarious, only several days after their arrival, colonist George Howe, while searching for crabs all alone, was brutally murdered by the natives, first being shot with 16 arrows, and then having his skull smashed in with a wooden bat. It was shortly after this point that, as we already know, White would leave the colony in 1587 in an attempt to receive reinforcements and supplies for the colony back in England. And upon his return in 1590, would find it completely abandoned, the houses apparently looted and stripped of any valuables. With all of this information laid out, let's explore what might have actually happened to all these people. Upon first glance, given the backstory of the original settlement, which had very bad relations with the natives, it would seem that they were simply killed by the Native Americans. However, according to White, this did not appear to have been a likely scenario. In fact, he seemed pretty certain of where the colonists had gone. As stated earlier, the colonists had left the word Croatoan carved into a fence post, along with the word crow carved into a tree. Before his departure from the colony those several years ago, him and the colonists had decided that should they need to abandon the island, the settlers would leave behind a token indicating their new destination. Moreover, and perhaps more importantly, they were also instructed to carve a very specific cross shape if they had encountered any sort of distress. But no such cross was found anywhere within the abandoned colony, implying to John White that they had left of their own volition. Instead, he was certain that they had simply safely made their way to the island of Croatoan, located approximately 40 miles to the south. White and his crew would attempt to locate the colonists by making their way to the island, but unfortunately, they would never make it. The weather had been so treacherous that despite multiple attempts to sail down the coast, the ship simply couldn't make the journey to Croatoan, forcing White to return back to England without making contact with the settlers he had traversed the Atlantic to assist. There was also a case around 1607 when Native American leader Powhatan captured future colonial governor John Smith and told him that he knew of a place where people who wore European clothing were living. Smith would eventually draw a map of Virginia the following year, marking an area where, allegedly, 4 people who had traveled from Roanoke Island now lived. Sadly, due to the passage of time and the lack of any further inquiry into his entry, it's impossible to say who exactly these men were, if they were a part of the lost colony, or if they even existed at all. Another theory surrounds the discovery of inscribed stones, allegedly written by John White's daughter, Eleanor Dare, a member of the lost Roanoke Colony. The first of these stones, dubbed the Dare Stones, was reported in the year 1937 by Lewis E. Hammond, who supposedly discovered the stone near the Chowan River, inland from the Outer Banks. For reference, Virginia Dare was Ananias Dare and Eleanor Dare's daughter, actually the very first English person to be born in America. The front side of the stone, notably written beneath a cross, reads the following: Ananias Dare and Virginia went hence to heaven, 1591. Any Englishman show this rock to John White, governor of Virginia. Flipping the stone over, the message continues, describing how the colonists moved further inland a short while after White had returned to England, and that they experienced only misery as a result of attacks from local tribes and illness, dwindling their numbers to just 24. After a ship was spotted along the coast, which Eleanor states the colonists didn't believe was her father, John White, the natives, fearing revenge, appeared to have fled, before returning later to attack the settlers. This resulted in the death of her child Virginia and husband Ananias, among many others, bringing their numbers down even more to just 7. From there, those who remained buried their dead and marked their grave with a tombstone. A series of professors from Emory University followed Hammond to where he claimed to have found the stone, and although the group could not determine the exact location of where it was discovered, the professors were apparently convinced that Hammond was a reliable source. From there, however, rumors began to spark of the discovery of other stones, some being the tombstone of the deceased colonists, others spinning stories purportedly inscribed by the colonists, detailing where they had gone after leaving the colony. A total of 48 stones were allegedly found, largely the result of a reward offer, with each of the stones found after the original having a distinctly different style, as well as other discrepancies. It was eventually found that each of the 47 stones found after the original were all faked by a Georgia stonecutter. However, the validity of the original Dare stone still sort of hangs in the balance without any information being available to support or refute it. There are many other theories surrounding this case, including that they had all been captured by natives living on Croatoan and that they had simply sort of assimilated into their society, or that they were all just murdered and that their remains were apparently hidden well enough to have not been found in the last, say, 400 years. Overall, like many of the other entries on this iceberg, it's possible that we'll never have some of the answers to history's most burning questions. The Sodder Children. It was Christmas Eve, 1945, in Fayetteville, West Virginia, at the Sodder residence, home to George, his wife Jenny, and their 9 children. Marion, the 19-year-old eldest daughter, had saved up enough money from her job at the local dime store to gift new toys to 3 of her younger sisters, Martha, Jenny, and Betty, aged 12, 8, and 6. They were ecstatic and begged their parents to let them stay up late to play, along with the 2 youngest brothers, Maurice and Louis, aged 14 and 10. Even though it was already 10 p.m., their mother obliged, reminding the children to feed the cows and close the chicken coop before bed. After that, she took the youngest daughter, 2-year-old Sylvia, up to bed with her. The father and 2 youngest boys, John and George Jr., aged 16 and 22, were already asleep upstairs. Sometime around 1:30 in the morning, their mother, Jenny, would be awoken by the smell of smoke. She would jump out of bed and find that George's office was on fire, with the flames specifically sprouting from the telephone line and fuse box. Jenny quickly woke up her husband and escaped with him, along with 4 of their children, Marion, Sylvia, John, and George Jr. However, despite their desperate calls and pleas to the remaining 5 children, who were apparently still upstairs, they would receive no response. George would then rush back into the home to try and rescue the remainder of his children, but was blocked from entering the 2nd floor as the stairs were violently ablaze. From there, George would unsuccessfully attempt to scale the side of the house to reach the upper floor, but broke a window in the process, slicing his arm. From there, George and his sons decided to use a ladder to try and get inside, but found that it was missing from where it always sat. Now grasping at straws, the family would hop into one of George's coal trucks in order to pull up alongside of the house and climb up onto the roof of the vehicle and into the house. However, this truck, strangely, wouldn't start. They then tried the 2nd truck, which, like the first, also wouldn't start, despite both of them having been in perfect working order the previous day. After attempting to use the house's phone, which no longer worked, 19-year-old Marion would bolt over to their neighbor's house in order to contact the fire department, but for some reason, the operator never picked up. Another nearby neighbor would also attempt to call the fire department, but they would also fail to make contact with the operator. This neighbor would then make their way to the fire department themselves, informing Fire Chief F.J. Morris of the current situation at the Sodder home. By this point, however, the family had come to the horrific realization that there was nothing they could do but wait for first responders, and they would sit there for the rest of the 45 minutes it would take for the house to burn to the ground. Somehow, the fire department wouldn't arrive until 8 o'clock in the morning. At first, it seemed painfully obvious that the children had just died in the fire. Despite this, however, after the firefighters would begin combing through the burned-down home, they would find no remains of the children. Not a single bone of any of the 5 kids was ever found at the scene. Even still, Fire Chief Morris believed that the fire had simply burned so hot that it essentially cremated the children, turning their bones to ash. Although this appears to make sense at first, the truth is a little bit more complicated than that. The modern cremation process involves burning remains at very high temperatures before removing the skeleton from the furnace and grinding the bones down. They don't typically burn to ash all on their own. Despite this oddity, the fire department would eventually deem the cause of the fire to have been faulty wiring within the home, which puzzled George as he had very recently had the entire house rewired for the installation of an electric stove. It was even inspected by the local electrical company, which deemed the home to be safe. Furthermore, the members of the family recalled that the Christmas lights, and therefore the electricity, had remained on while the house was burning, suggesting that the electrical system had remained in working order. As the family began to investigate some of the events which took place before the fire started, they began to question the official reported cause of the wiring, believing something more sinister to have occurred. As it turns out, around an hour before the fire started at 12:30 a.m., George's wife Jenny had woken up to answer a phone call downstairs, with the caller having been a woman whose voice was not familiar to Jenny. The caller asked for someone who Jenny didn't recognize. She noted the sound of laughter and clinking glasses in the background. She then informed the caller that she had phoned the wrong number before hanging up and returning upstairs to go back to bed. If you'll recall, 19-year-old Marion attempted to use the home's phone during the fire, but found that by that point it was no longer connected. After the fire, however, a telephone repairman would inform the Sodders that the house's phone line had in fact not been burned through during the fire, but had been cut by someone willing to climb 14 feet up a nearby telephone pole to do so. Also of note is the fact that another 30 minutes after receiving the strange phone call, Jenny was again woken up by the sound of an object loudly banging into the house's roof, followed by some kind of rolling noise. It's also important to consider the fact that neither of George's two trucks had started that night, possibly having been tampered with by the same person or people who cut the phone line and were potentially heard on the roof. With all of these facts considered, George and Jenny slowly began to form the belief that their children were, in fact, not dead, and that the fire had been deliberately started as some kind of ruse in order to get away with kidnapping them. As it turns out, with some important information on George's backstory, a motive for a crime like this actually turns out to make a fair bit of sense. George had actually been born in Italy before emigrating to the United States at the age of 13. Jenny had a similar childhood, coming to America at a young age. At the time, Fayetteville had a large population of Italian immigrants, which was a factor in why they chose to settle there. However, keeping in mind that World War II had only come to an end earlier that year, people were still very passionate about their respective causes back in their homeland, such as the Italian Americans of Fayetteville. Despite this, George was not afraid to share his opposition towards Italian dictator Benito Mussolini. He was known to have sparked many strong arguments with other immigrants who lived in the area at the time. One particular example of this occurred in October of 1945, just 2 months before the fire would occur, when a visiting life insurance salesman was rejected by George. The man, angered by him, warned that his house would go, quote, up in smoke and your children are going to be destroyed, as a result of the dirty remarks you have been making about Mussolini. So if that wasn't somehow connected to this case, I'd have to say that it's probably one of the biggest coincidences of all time. Again, he said that to George 2 months before his house would, in fact, go up in flames and his children would never be seen again. Many currently believe that these factors indicate that the Sicilian mafia had caught wind of George's remarks towards the now overthrown Italian government and basically just decided to teach him a lesson. The final and possibly strangest lead into the disappearance of the children came in the year 1967, over 2 decades after the fire, when a letter arrived in the mail addressed to Jenny Sodder containing this photograph. There was no return address listed on the letter, but it had been postmarked from Central City, Kentucky. On the back, it read, "Louis Sodder, I love brother Frankie, Lil Boys, A90132 or 35. Jenny believed that the young man in the photo was her son Louis, age 9 when the fire tore through the home. He possessed the same brown eyes, dark curly hair, strong nose, and upwardly tilting left eyebrow that Louis could be seen with in photos of him as a young boy. The family ended up sending a private investigator to Central City, but they never came back with any useful information. There have been plenty of other leads in this case, but unfortunately they've all come back as dead ends. Every single one of the original members of the Sodder family have now passed away, none of them receiving any closure or answers as to what happened to their 5 brothers and sisters those many years ago. Although it would be very easy to just say that the children perished in the fire, it is very strange that not a single bone was ever found from the site, especially given what we know about the cremation process. Even if you do believe that these children died in the fire, there were still so many oddities around this case that seem to indicate some sort of foul play happening here. The Yemenite Children Affair. Between June 1949 and September 1950, Operation Magic Carpet, or Operation On the Wings of Eagles, brought nearly 50,000 Jews from Yemen to the newly established state of Israel, liberating them and their families from the deteriorating situation in Yemen and other Middle Eastern countries following the Arab-Israeli War in 1948. Upon their arrival between the late 40s and early 50s, however, many of these newly arrived Yemeni children, somewhere between 1,000 and 500 of them, allegedly disappeared without a trace. This would almost exclusively occur within hospitals, involving many immigrant children, primarily coming from Yemen, but also some from other Middle Eastern and North African Jewish communities. There are many reports within Israeli hospitals at the time where mothers would go into labor, have their children, and soon after would be told that they hadn't survived the night. Without seeing a body or being given any further information, they would be sent home. Parents of older Yemeni children, though typically no older than the age of 3, would also experience similar horrors. Their children would allegedly be transported to the hospital, sometimes due to them actually being sick, but others for simple checkups. Then, without the issuing of a death certificate or any record or documentation at all as to what had occurred, their families would be informed by word of mouth alone that their children had passed away. Horrifyingly, these families would receive no real evidence that their child had actually passed away. They would never have the bodies returned for a funeral, and there would be little to no system in place for them to obtain more information from the government or from health officials. Even more peculiar, in almost every case, they would only be informed that their child had abruptly passed away after the funeral was held without them. According to an article published by the BBC, most parents received no information about their child's grave, But when they did, in some cases, the grave would be completely empty. Later DNA tests on those that did contain bodies have occasionally come back negative. The bodies, apparently, weren't even their children's. The suspicious nature of these deaths led to large portions of the public crying out for answers, with rumors spreading that the children had actually been kidnapped and given up for adoption without their knowledge, with many speculating that they were being given or perhaps even sold to Holocaust survivors who had either lost their children during the war or who couldn't have any of their own. The case would remain a heated topic of debate within the country for many years, with the families of the missing children believing that some kind of terrible operation was underway. Others held the belief that these children had just died in the hospital and that the families were simply in denial at the loss of their children. Public outrage would continue for many years, eventually culminating in the establishment of several committees by the Israeli government to investigate the cases of these missing children. However, each of the 4 committees working between the years 1967 and 2001 all concluded the fact that the children had simply passed away. So, after 4 separate investigations, all reaching the same conclusion, it was case closed. It turns out that there were no missing children at all. No tragedy had occurred here other than the loss of these young children's lives. Families, at the very least, could receive some closure, finally knowing the truth behind what happened. Except that it wasn't the truth. At the very least, not entirely. Fast forwarding 15 years from the closure of the Kedmi Commission's investigation to 2016, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu called upon Tzachi Hanegbi, a prime minister within the government, to review all conclusions and evidence uncovered from the past 3 investigations. Following this, the government published nearly the full extent of their archived findings online, and a disturbing truth came to light. Again, according to the same article by the BBC, quote, testimony given under oath at one of the earlier inquiries revealed that 4 undernourished babies died after being given an experimental protein injection, and that many children died as a result of medical negligence. Even more disturbing, many of these children were then examined post-mortem before some would have their hearts removed and sent over to the United States, where doctors would study them to further investigate the low rates of heart disease in Yemen. Following these examinations, many children would be buried in mass graves, a violation of Jewish tradition. Nurit Koren, the chair of this special committee, stated that, quote, it's a big scandal that the doctors didn't tell the parents that they were doing experiments and research on their children. And even worse, there are healthy babies who died from an experimental treatment. It's a crime, it was on purpose, and it led to their death. Hanegbi, the official who was appointed to re-examine the evidence by the prime minister, went on Israeli TV and declared that they took the children and gave them away. I don't know where. He acknowledged that hundreds of children were taken without the consent of their parents. Despite these bold statements from high-ranking officials, as well as all of these archived documents being released to the public, there still is very little concrete evidence proving exactly what happened to these children. The opinions of government officials and researchers vary widely, with many of them pointing to the mortality rates which were very high among Yemeni children at the time. The situation remains murky. It's hard to say if we'll ever know that this was a massive government cover-up, or simply a horrifically insensitive failure to document the deaths of thousands of children. The Iguala mass kidnapping. Our next case takes place in Mexico around 10 years ago, on the 26th of September, 2014. A group of around 100 students attending the Ayotzinapa Rural Teachers College had been traveling in a caravan of buses towards Mexico City, where they planned to attend a protest commemorating the anniversary of the 1968 Tlatelolco massacre, in which the Mexican armed forces opened fire on a group of unarmed citizens. They had been passing through the city of Iguala, Guerrero on that day, where they intended to protest a function held by Jose Luis Arbaca, the mayor of Iguala, as well as his wife, Maria de Los Angeles Pineda. They were planning to advocate against the discriminatory hiring practices of teachers. At around 9:30 p.m., however, they were held up in their buses by police, who almost immediately began opening fire upon the students. They attempted to defend themselves against the officers by throwing rocks and other objects, but obviously that wouldn't be enough to get them out of this terrifying situation. One student named Aldo Gutierrez would eventually be shot, left lying in the road, brain dead. From this point, all of the other students took cover behind the bus while they continued to be shot at by police. In the aftermath of the event, 30 bullet holes were counted on the side of the bus. Despite the students pleading with the police to stop shooting, shouting that they were unarmed, they continued the assault, injuring 2 more of them. Some students fled into the hills surrounding the area. A little over an hour after the assault began, the officers approached the buses with their weapons raised and forced the students and bus driver to exit the vehicle before covering their heads with hoods, loading them into several different police vehicles, and driving away. A separate bus containing more of the students was also stopped by the police in a similar fashion shortly after the first, before the police threw tear gas inside and began opening fire on that vehicle as well. When all was said and done, 2 students inside of the bus had been killed, and 25 were injured. 43 have fallen off the face of the earth and haven't been seen or heard from in nearly a decade. It goes without saying that those who were responsible for this horrifically tragic event deserve to be held accountable for their crimes, but to this day, it's still very difficult to point your finger at any one party or person. The leading theory and official explanation given by the Mexican government blames Mayor Arbaca and his wife Maria, both of whom may have ordered the police to intercept the students. They had most likely become aware that the students had planned to protest their event that night and didn't want any opposition. The students were then handed over to the Guerreros Unidos drug cartel by the Igualan police, and allegedly they were all murdered after that point and burned in a dump, along with all of their clothes and identifiable belongings being incinerated. One of the leaders of the Guerreros Unidos cartel actually went on record stating that Maria was actually at the head of much of the criminal activities within Iguala, and that Mayor Arbaca would routinely be paid millions of pesos in order to play nicely with the criminals and turn the other cheek. Shortly after his family started to be accused of these crimes, he would take a 30-day leave of absence from his position as mayor before skipping town with his family, later being tracked down to Mexico City, where they were arrested. However, this official explanation has been heavily contested by the families of the victims, who believe a greater cover-up is occurring. It's possible that, under heavy pressure by the public, the higher-ups in the Mexican federal government simply want to bring the case to rest in order to calm the population and deliver on campaign promises, without providing proof of their claims to the families or to the nation. A panel of experts was assembled by the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights back in 2015, who concluded that it would have been, quote, scientifically impossible for the students to have been killed in a garbage dump in the way that the federal government claimed them to have been. This case really just has so many conflicting theories and conflicting bits of information that make it difficult to piece together what actually happened. For instance, some believe that the mayor of Iguala ordered for the students to be stopped before they could interrupt the political event he was holding with his wife on the night of the kidnapping, as we discussed earlier. However, others believe that the students were taken as a direct result of the political leanings of the school that they had come from, which was known for its left-wing activism and radicalism. Others propose that the cartel members, in collusion with the police, became angered when they refused to pay extortion money, which they could have demanded when their buses were stopped that night, and that from there, they were attacked and kidnapped. Other theories and further information does exist out there if you want to do some research on your own, but again, with all of the conflicting information and kind of the muddy sources that are out there, it's hard to say if we'll ever know exactly what happened to these students on that fateful September night. I was hoping to at least get through layer 2 in this video, but we did not do that. I just prefer not to skim over the cases. I really like to dive deep into them and provide as much information as I can in a video like this. If you enjoyed this first episode of the Mass Disappearances Iceberg, be sure to let me know in the comments that you'd like to see a part 2.